I've never been much of a storyteller, but what happened to me a few years ago has stuck with me like a scar. It's one of those things you can't really explain away, even if you try to rationalize it. I'm not really the superstitious type, or at least I wasn't back then. Now, I don't know anymore. This all started when I moved into a new house with my girlfriend, Sarah. We'd been together for about 3 years and decided it was time to get a place of our own. You know, the usual milestone stuff. Save some money, stop paying rent, try and build something long-term. We found this quaint little house just outside of town, kind of in the middle of nowhere, but close enough to civilization. It was cheap, probably because it was a bit run down and needed some work, but we figured we could handle it. The house was this old 2-story place with one of those big, creepy attics that you see in horror movies. The realtor had mentioned it was built in the 1920s, which was kind of cool at first. You know, the whole vintage charm thing. But I gotta be honest, the attic gave me weird vibes from the moment we walked in. It wasn't even something I could put my finger on at first. Just this unsettling feeling. Like every time I went up there, the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But of course, I brushed it off. Figured it was just the creep factor of an old house. Old places have drafts, creaky floorboards, weird acoustics. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. At least that's what I told myself. We settled in pretty quickly, getting the usual stuff in order. Unpacking boxes, painting, fixing a few things here and there. The attic, though, we left alone. Partly because it was a cluttered mess when we moved in. The previous owners had left behind a bunch of junk, old furniture, boxes of newspapers, some rusty tools, that kind of thing. It felt like it hadn't been touched in decades. Sarah suggested clearing it out, maybe turning it into a storage space or a little home office, but I wasn't in any rush to go up there. A couple of weeks went by without much happening. It was just life as usual. Until one night, when I heard something. I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, while Sarah was already asleep next to me. It was one of those nights where the house felt too quiet, if that makes sense. You know when silence almost feels loud? I don't know how to describe it better than that. Then I heard this faint thudding sound, like something was moving above us. It wasn't super loud, more like a soft shuffling, but it was enough to get my attention. At first, I thought it was maybe an animal, like a raccoon or something had gotten into the attic. I didn't think much of it and figured I'd check it out in the morning. The next day, I went up to the attic for the first time since we'd moved in. I brought a flashlight with me because the overhead light up there was busted. The second I pushed open the attic door, that feeling hit me again, like I was being watched, but I ignored it. It was broad daylight after all, and I wasn't about to let myself get freaked out over nothing. The attic was dusty and smelled musty, like old wood and forgotten things. As I shone the flashlight around, I noticed something weird. There were these long, deep scratch marks on the wooden floorboards. They were faint, like they'd been there for a long time, but they definitely weren't natural. It was like something had been clawing at the floor trying to get out, or maybe trying to get in. I didn't say anything to Sarah. I figured maybe it was from a previous owner or some animal that had gotten trapped up there at some point. The rational side of me was still trying to make sense of it. I didn't want to freak her out over what was probably nothing, but the noises kept happening. Night after night, I'd hear that same soft, shuffling sound. Sometimes it was louder, like something was dragging itself across the floor. Other times, it was so quiet, I wasn't even sure if I'd heard it or if it was just my imagination. But it wasn't just the noises that started to freak me out. It was the way the house felt at night. There were these cold spots. I'd walk through certain areas of the house and it'd feel like I'd stepped into a freezer for a split second. And then, there were the shadows. At first, I thought it was just the way the light hit things, but I started noticing them more often. Dark, fleeting shapes moving in the corners of my vision. And every time I tried to focus on them, they'd disappear. The worst part was, it wasn't just me anymore. Sarah started noticing things too. She didn't say anything at first, probably because she didn't want to seem paranoid or feed into my growing unease. But one night, while we were having dinner, she put her fork down and said, "Have you been hearing noises, like in the attic?" I stopped mid-bite, my stomach dropping. "Yeah," I said cautiously. "What have you heard?" She glanced up at the ceiling, like she could hear it right then. "I don't know. It's like scratching, and sometimes it sounds like footsteps, but slower, like someone dragging their feet." A chill ran down my spine. I'd been trying to convince myself that it was just animals or the house settling, but hearing Sarah describe the same sounds I'd been hearing, that made it real in a way I wasn't ready to deal with. We sat there in silence for a minute, both of us just staring at each other. Finally, I muttered, "Maybe we should get someone to check it out. Like an exterminator or something?" She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced it was just raccoons or rats. Neither was I, to be honest. The next day, I called an exterminator. He came out, did a thorough inspection of the house, and even went up into the attic. He spent about an hour poking around, looking for signs of pests, but when he came back down, he just shrugged. "There's no sign of any animals," he said. "No nests, no droppings, nothing. Place looks clean." That didn't make me feel better. A few days later, things escalated. It was late, around midnight, and Sarah and I were in bed, just drifting off to sleep when we heard it. This loud bang from the attic. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, or been thrown across the room. Both of us sat up, wide awake, our hearts pounding. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. I didn't answer. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and got out of bed, my legs shaking as I made my way to the attic door. Sarah followed behind me, clinging to my arm. When I pulled down the attic ladder, the air that rushed out was cold, colder than it had any right to be, considering it was the middle of summer. My breath fogged up as I climbed the stairs, and that sense of being watched hit me even harder than before. It was almost suffocating. When we reached the top, I shone the flashlight around, half expecting to find a raccoon, or maybe some broken furniture. But everything was just as we left it. The same dusty boxes, the same old chairs, except in the far corner, something caught my eye. There was a figure standing there. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, or maybe a coat hanging on a rack, but the more I stared, the more I realized it wasn't. It was a person, or at least something that looked like a person. Tall, hunched over, with long, spindly limbs, and a face that was just wrong. It was like someone had taken a person's face and stretched it, distorted it. Its eyes were too big, its mouth too wide, and it was grinning at us. I froze. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't even move. Sarah squeezed my arm so tight it hurt, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that thing. Then it moved. It didn't walk. It sort of glided across the floor. Slowly, almost lazily, like it had all the time in the world. It didn't make a sound, but the air around us seemed to hum with this low, vibrating energy, like the walls themselves were buzzing. The thing got closer, and that's when I noticed something even more horrifying. Its feet weren't touching the ground. It was floating. Suddenly, Sarah pulled me backward, snapping me out of my trance. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. We scrambled down the ladder, slammed the attic door shut, and bolted back to the bedroom, locking the door behind us. We sat there in the dark, clutching each other, not saying a word. I think we both knew that whatever was in the attic wasn't something you could just run away from. It was there, and it wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, we decided we couldn't stay in the house any longer. We packed up some essentials and went to stay with Sarah's parents for a few days. I wanted to call someone, an expert, maybe even a priest, but I didn't even know what to say. "Hey, there's a floating monster living in my attic," didn't seem like a believable opening line. While we were at her parents' house, I did some research on the history of the property. Turns out, the house had a bit of a dark past. Back in the 1940s, a man named Samuel had lived there with his family. From what I could gather, Samuel wasn't a good guy. He was abusive, controlling, and eventually, his wife and kids disappeared under mysterious circumstances. There were rumors, of course. People suspected he'd killed them and buried their bodies somewhere on the property, but no one could ever prove it. He died in the house a few years later, alone. That's when it all clicked for me. Whatever was in that attic, it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It felt angrier than that, more malicious, like it was feeding off the house itself, off the pain and suffering that had taken place there. After a few days away, I went back to the house alone. Sarah refused to come with me, which I couldn't blame her for. I didn't plan on staying long. I just needed to grab a few more things, maybe try and get some closure. The second I stepped through the front door, the air felt thick, like walking through a fog of tension. I made my way up to the attic one last time, flashlight in hand. The house was silent, unnervingly so. But as soon as I pulled down the attic ladder, that humming sound started up again. Low, barely audible, but there. I climbed the steps slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. When I reached the top, the attic was just as I'd left it, empty. But that figure was there again, standing in the same corner, watching me. This time, though, I wasn't frozen with fear. I knew what I had to do. I don't know where the idea came from, but something in my gut told me to speak to it. So I did. "I know what you are," I said, my voice shaking, "and you don't belong here anymore." For a moment, nothing happened. The figure just stood there, staring at me with those wide, too big eyes. Then, slowly, it started to fade, like a shadow retreating as the sun rises. The buzzing in the air grew louder, almost deafening. And then, silence. I don't know if it's gone for good. I'd like to think it is, that I somehow banished whatever was haunting that place. But even now, years later, I can still feel it sometimes. In the quiet moments when I'm alone, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow that doesn't belong, a cold spot in the room. I sold the house a few months after that. I didn't tell the new owners anything. Part of me feels guilty about that, but what was I supposed to say? They seemed happy, excited to start their new life in that old house. I can only hope whatever was in the attic has finally found peace. But if I'm being honest, I doubt it.